Good morning, church. Happy Sunday. It's good to be with you today as we prepare our hearts for worship and look ahead for the things that God has in store for us today. 1 Samuel 24 has a lot to do with God's timing, where David refused to preemptively raise his hand against Saul. We'll see that's a regular habit of his. He just won't get ahead of God. He refuses to. And that is what will cause his kingdom to be established, waiting for God and allowing God to take the lead. And that's a good indicator for us here. We're not going to rush God. We're going to walk right along with his time frames and trust him. And God will often do things in different ways. He does not always function the same way. In Matthew 8, when we see a couple different accounts of God's power, proves that point out in a couple really interesting ways. I especially appreciate the two different approaches that Jesus takes, first to the leper and then to the centurion's servant. And it proves a really important point, especially for the leper. So he's coming off the Sermon on the Mount. He's delivered the best sermon that's ever been delivered for all time. And the crowds are following him. And the first encounter that he has is with a leper. Jews weren't allowed to touch lepers. Lepers lived outside the communities because they could transmit not just their skin disease, but they could transmit uncleanness, ritual defilement by contact. So they had to, it's a weird image, but the Old Testament says, cover their upper lip and call out unclean, unclean wherever they went. That was their punishment for being a leper. And so Jesus does the unthinkable. He stretches out his hand and he touches him. He touches the leper. If he wasn't Jesus, this would have been an outrageous thing culturally and practically. I mean, you really could contract a serious disease doing what he did. But this demonstrates a reality. One, Jesus is a compassionate man because our God is a compassionate God. And two, that Jesus cannot be made unclean. He can only transmit his holiness. Nothing bad can come on him. The only time something like that happens is at the cross, when he becomes sin for us. And that is something that God does. But up until that point, no defilement can come upon him. It's not possible. And we see that he didn't have to touch the leper. It really was an act of compassion, because our next narrative event is the centurion and his servant, when he just heals with a word from however long he could have spoken to the leper and healed him. He didn't. He could have gone to the centurion's house. He didn't do that either. In both cases, he did what he thought was God's will and the right choice in these situations. And so, church, that's our big takeaway. Number one, we're always waiting on God and his timing, like David. And two, we understand that how God is going to operate in us and through us is going to look different all the time, depending on the situation. So let's never get caught in a rut, thinking that God needs to do things in a particular way. But let's trust him and follow him and delight that he is both good and powerful. He loves us and we love him, and through that love, we are able to go out and love a lost and hurting world. Well, I love you, church, and I sure look forward to seeing you today.